Welcome, everybody. So glad you could make it back. As usual, this is our lunchtime seminar for organic farmers, and we have the pleasure of having Jasmin Ramirez Bonilla with us today. She is a master's student in Ian Grettenberger's lab. And I first met Jasmin because she worked as a field assistant for us in our office. So that was a really wonderful experience. And then she carried that experience forward, working with Rachel Long and into the entomology department at UC Davis. So we're really lucky to have her field experience and now her master's level training working on entomology. So she has undertaken the challenging topic of managing cucumber beetles, which is so important. And so today she'll be sharing some of her research that she's been doing with the Grettenberger lab in and around Yolo County and other places, really trying to explore their ecology in the area, and then also irrigation pheromone. So thank you so much, Jasmin, for taking time to come here. And we're gonna have questions at the end. So this will, as usual, be like about a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and there should be plenty of time for that. All right, Jasmin.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Margaret. And hello, everyone. I am very excited and thankful for this opportunity to share some of the work I've been doing for the past 2 years. So my title for this talk is Spots and Stripes, Two Bandits of the West. And I'm hoping to cover the ecology and a new irrigation pheromone of cucumber beetles. So yeah, like Margaret was saying, I'm a master's student. I'm on my second year of my 3-year program. So I work with Ian Grettenberger, who's the extension specialist for entomology in the state. So yeah, let's get started. So today's talk, I am hoping to cover the biology of the two species of western cucumber beetles. So we have the spotted cucumber beetle and the striped cucumber beetle. And I'm hoping to cover the description, what they look like, the phenology, so how many generations we have per year, the damage that they cause to the crops. And then we're gonna move into my thesis projects, which fall under the broader umbrella of insect ecology. And in specific, we're gonna be talking about some studies that I've done with the non-crop habitat of the western striped cucumber beetle. And last but not least, I'm going to be covering some of the work I've been doing with a new irrigation pheromone, which was synthesized for the East Coast species of the striped cucumber beetle, but I will elaborate on that as we go through the presentation. So let's get started with the first star of the show, which is the western striped cucumber beetle. So this guy, its Latin name is Echolima tributatum. It is an oligophagous species, and what this means is that it's a specialist on one type of plant family. In this case, the Cucurbitaceae, which is the family of gourds. And it is a key pest of melons, especially out here in Northern California. So the larvae will feed on the roots because that's what the eggs are laid at the bottom of the plant, on the crown of the root. And then the eggs will hatch, and that very tiny larvae will begin to feed on those roots. Consequently, the adults will feed on the foliage, but mostly on the fruit. They love the fruit, especially those tender fruits when they're just coming out of the flower. And they create this scarring type of damage on the fruit. So in these pictures, I hope that you can see them well, but they're quite tiny eggs and very, very hard to see. So that just already creates a problem for growers trying to find out whether they're laying eggs or not on their fields. And so I was able to get this root from a seedling that I planted myself, and then I threw some cucumber beetles in there, and then they laid eggs. And then the larvae is also quite hard to see them. So, I really never had any luck in the field to find them just hanging out. I usually just always find the adults. So that's quite, yeah, it's quite difficult to just find them with the naked eye, I guess. And I also wanted to introduce the slide just for clarification purposes, that there is some beetles in the same family that look alike. And sometimes you think you have cucumber beetles and it could be the Western corn rootworm. And the main characteristic to differentiate them is to look for the abdomen. The Western corn rootworm has a yellow abdomen, whereas the striped cucumber beetle has a black abdomen. And that's pretty much what the main characteristic that I use to differentiate them in the field. Then we have the Western spotted cucumber beetle, which is a secondary species that is also a pest of cucurbits out here in Northern California. And so this guy is polyphagous, which means that it is a generalist. It would feed on many different things such as tomatoes, alfalfa. You know, they're kind of everywhere all the time, and they're very active throughout the year. They are considered a milder pest because they feed mostly on the foliage and the flower of the plant and not so much on the fruit. And so this graph here is just to have a graphic representation of what the peaks and generations look like per year for each species. I borrowed this graph from a former graduate student at Davis whose thesis was also on cucumber beetles. And he sampled this on melon fields, and we can see that most of the generations for the striped cucumber beetle occur in the field, and they have up to 6 generations in the fields. However, for the Western spotted cucumber beetle, we can see that there is mostly a very low number, and that's because they tend to lay their eggs on other crops, and they migrate to the fields once the crops are in the field. So that's a very interesting observation. And then we see that at the end of the season, when we have post-harvest time, I think that this is when they increase their numbers because they are going into the overwintering stage and they want to survive when there is not really those viable hosts out there on the fields. Now we're going to move into the damage. So I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I would like to say that for my work, I'm mostly focusing on the Western striped cucumber beetle because this guy is considered the most detrimental one to the industry. They tend to feed mostly on the fruit, and that causes a lot of problems. So I am still going to be talking about the Western spotted cucumber beetle, but the striped is the focus of my thesis, just for clarification purposes. Okay, so the damage, right? On the right here, we see a melon that has larvae damage. And so sometimes the larvae can feed on the fruit as well. And if there is like super infested fields, the larvae will feed on the fruit, not only the roots, but also the fruit. Whereas the spotted cucumber beetle, again, also from personal observations, I always tend to find them inside of the flowers or on the foliage, not so much on the fruit. So that's why I guess they're considered mostly, a milder pest, right? So, and it's important to note as well that they can still infest the fields, right? Because if you go into a field, and I'm sure many of you have noticed this, there is hundreds of them flying around, but they mostly feed on the foliage and the flowers, and so not much on the fruit, and that's why they're considered a milder pest. Okay, so again, like I said, I will be focusing mostly on the Western striped cucumber beetle. So for context on this slide, I picked the damage, the threshold damage for conventional operations. So there is very low tolerance in conventional operations for cosmetic damage of the melons. And I just wanted to draw the point here that anything larger than a quarter size is considered unmarketable. So it can be really problematic if you have a fruit that looks like the one on the very bottom right, where it's majority of it is scarred. And I'm also interested, I guess we can discuss this at the end, but what is the threshold for organic growers, or how much damage you guys can sustain on your fruit, if it matters at all? But also, it is important to know that these guys, like I said, they can take out fields, right? If they have young seedlings out there, they can weaken those field stands, and the plant can really come back if they devour the entire thing, and they can feed they get very hungry out there. So now, just where in California is the Western striped cucumber beetle a problem, right? So their geographic range is pretty much the entire state. They go from the south to the very tip of the north of the state. However, here in Northern California is considered mostly a problematic species, right? Because there is a lot of melon production out here, especially soft melons and soft skin melons, such as honeydew, cantaloupes, and that type of thing. So this is where I come in as a graduate student. And, when I joined the lab with Ian Grettenberger, he said, we have a grant with cucumber beetles, and these guys are quite kind of unknown, really. Like, there's always questions among PCAs, growers, and other people in industry wondering, where do they go after the fields are harvested? What is their behavior prior to planting? So there's really, even though there's monitoring and there are practices to look for them, there is still a lot of, there's a lack of really defining a specific non-crop habitat for these guys. So this is why I'm focusing mostly on the Western striped cucumber beetle, because the spotted cucumber beetle seems to move a lot around different crops. So you would find them on alfalfa when there is no melons in the field. So that seems to be a little bit more, there's more direction on that area. Whereas the striped cucumber beetle is just kind of unknown, really. I mean, there's still information out there, of course. So there have been field observations and field studies that say that that these guys overwinter underneath tree bark and other protective structures. I have also talked to some growers who say they have seen him underneath tree bark as well, and we agree with these observations. And then also this graduate student Andrew Peterson also noted them on different vegetation such as wild weeds around the area. However, it is not well defined as to we haven't really identified specific weeds that they're attracted to. Do they just hang out in these areas because the weed are abundant? So it's just, there's still a lot of some gaps of understanding how they use this non-crop habitat. So to answer those questions and trying to identify and characterize this non-crop habitat, I carried out some observational studies last year, actually right when the pandemic hit, beginning of March. Like, I think it was March 20th when it hit, and I was doing my stuff out there. But I was privileged enough that there's really people out there in the field, so I was still able to carry out my research and get some data. So the study pretty much consisted of deploying yellow sticky cards on 8 different locations in each field. I had 2 sampling sites, and the locations were picked based on the type of vegetation and type of habitat that was around the farms. So in organic farms, there's usually a lot of diversity among wild weed species. We see a lot of different vegetation around, even this water bank here where we see, there's some grasses and stuff like that. And so I really based my sampling sites on that, where I was like, we might find them on these areas based on those observational studies that have occurred in the past, and thus that evidence from growers as well that they say, they're hanging out around. So this is just a picture here to display the distinct type of habitats that I sampled. And so we can see here that, on the left, there is an area full of milk thistle. And then we see on this other area, it's mostly wall barley. So there were different types of abundances of weeds. And I forgot to mention, we actually also ran weed abundance assessments. So we wanted to draw a relationship between beetle captures and the type of weeds that were in that area. And so these graphs right here are just the captures of beetles using each monitoring strategy. So I had the yellow sticky card out there, and I also collected 20 sweeps every week. and I carried out visual counts for 4 minutes. So we see that at the beginning, on farm 1, we have a large number of beetles, and those are the overwintering beetles that hang out in those areas actually. And we see that there is a nice relationship with the 3 different types of monitoring strategies where, I caught them all with the yellow sticky cards had the most high numbers because they were out there for a week. But then if I swept the area, I also caught a lot of them. So they are hanging out on those specific areas and those unmanaged areas, excuse me. And so on farm number 2, we see that there is not that many at the beginning, but then again, we see another boom. And that's where I saw more like vegetation growing around the areas. So it seems to be like driven by the amount of vegetation around the farms. So if you have a lot of weeds, most likely they'll be out there. And so for this graphs over here, this is just a representation of the number of beetles observed per specific weed species. And so on the y-axis, we have the number of beetles observed. And then on the x-axis, we have the dates of sampling. So we see that I had a high number on site number 1 of plants, just, when they were flying around, or I found them on the ground. And this is the data that I caught using those visual counts. So this is where I would be looking at the ground or at the area in each location for 4 minutes at each trap and just seeing, okay, where do I find them and on what type of weed. So I recorded that, and most of them were off plants, but I also found a good number of them on little mallow, which is the cheeseweed. And then I also found some of them on milk thistle, which was a pretty abundant weed as well, and some on mustards and some on California bird clover. So on the farm number 2, I found way less beetles. And this is because this farm actually planted their cucurbits in a much earlier time. So that explains the beetles just migrating into the fields, and they weren't present as much on the non-crop habitat areas. And this is just a list of the different types of weeds that were found at each sampling site. And we see that the most common ones were wall barley. I think some people call it foxtail grass as well. It goes by many names, but I identified it, and the common name seems to be wall barley. We also had milk thistle, little mallow, and these seem to be like the most abundant types of weeds, and where we also found them the most of the times. So there is a relationship between these broadleaf weeds and the number of beetles that we found. However, it is still unclear whether this relationship is because the beetles prefer these specific weeds, or it just happens that there are a lot of this type of weeds out there. So I'm going to continue doing studies on this. And in order to figure that question out, whether they really like milk thistle, or they really like little mallow, or they just happen to be hanging out on them, I'm going to deploy, at the moment, I have a study in the field where I have 4 different species of weeds, and I'm going to collect data on the preference. So just seeing which plants get the most visitations and whether they feed on that or not. And this is just a photo of a milk thistle leaf that I threw on a container with some striped cucumber beetles, and they actually munch on them. So that is just, just an observation, but that can really just have like a good background to run that study and see that, they might be feeding on these plants. Okay. And so most importantly, how does this all this information, all this non-crop habitat information can inform IPM for cucumber beetles, right? So by identifying this non-crop habitat and this non-crop hosts, it can really streamline that process of monitoring and reduce the time that you spent out there in those fields looking for these guys. and and really reduce the amount of resources. Instead of spending 3-4 hours, you can just know that they will be feeding on milk thistle or little mallow, and possibly this could move on to weed management, removing those weeds that they are frequently visiting and feeding on. All right, I'm gonna have some water. Okay, so I guess we're doing good time. Now I'm going to move into the second part of the talk, which is the aggregation pheromone. Just for context, I want to point out that the aggregation pheromone was synthesized for the eastern species. So the eastern striped cucumber beetle is just a sister species of the western striped cucumber beetle. And the main difference is their geographic range. And, they're pretty much just divided by the Rocky Mountains. And they do have, different they have different environments, climate, that type of thing. Like the eastern species beetle, they deal with snow out there, whereas this western spotted, it never has to deal with the snow. So it's active most of the year. So the aggregation pheromone was named, or actually I should say the specific chemicals in that aggregation pheromone was identified as beta-lactone. And the way they did this is, some really cool chemical ecology where they just identified this volatiles that were being produced by, these herbal volatiles that were being produced by the male striped cucumber beetle. And they identified these chemicals and mimic that scent. And then they ran trials on whether the aggregation pheromone was attracted to the cucumber beetles, and they realized that it was attractive to males and females. So it wasn't a sex pheromone, it's an aggregation pheromone where, everyone is really just like, hey, there's food here, there'd be potential for mating and all that type of thing. Our collaborator, Don Weber, in the East Coast, he, included us in this project. And once they realized that there is benefit out there in the East Coast, and also because they're so similar biologically, we also had the question whether it would work here in the West Coast as well. So to answer those questions, I also ran another trial last year that started in April of 2020 and it ended in November of 2020. And this was, again, just 2 organic sites, the same sites that I run the noncrop habitat study at. And then we had 2 treatments that consisted of putting a pheromone on this clear sticky trap and in a trap where there was no pheromone for control. And then at the end of the season, we added a floral lure to the pheromone just to see the combination of the 2 components to see whether the capture of beetles would increase. And so I know there's a lot going on in this graph, so I'm going to try and break it down as much as possible. This is farm number 1 for Western striped cucumber beetle captures. And on this farm, it's important to note that there was a period of the time of the sampling where it was pre-planting. So that means there were no crops in the field. It was just bare with those weeds around, the non-crop habitat. So I was still able to catch some of them with the pheromone. However, once we start that planting season on the vegetative state, and that's when, when the seedlings are growing those green leaves and all that, we see a decline on captures. And that's because, all the beetles are just moving into those fields and feeding on that. And it seems that there is a competition, it's just really hard to compete with the field and the pheromone. So if you have a crop in the field, most likely the pheromone won't be as effective. It will still have some captures, but it's harder. And then, of course, once we have the harvest time, again, there's that dispersal event where the beetles again start moving, and And then there's that attraction to the pheromone as well as to the floral lure plus pheromone. And I must mention that, there is a visible increase in captures with the pheromone plus the floral lure. So this just really shows that there is an enhanced capture when using the floral lure and the pheromone. Oh, I didn't explain this, but the floral lure is just like, I don't really know the specific composition of the chemicals in it, but it is marketed as the floral scent of melon plants or cucurbit plants. So yeah, it's a very interesting trend here that we see throughout the season, where we could kind of conclude that at the end of the pheromone seems to be more effective for monitoring previous to the planting. And although it's not as useful at the end of the season to monitor because you won't have crops there, but at least it gives you an idea of what the numbers are like when you're going into the fall. And then we also collected data on Western spotted cucumber beetle. Again, these two species are quite similar, they're cousins. So it's, it was might as well collect data on them, since I started realizing that there were a lot of beetles being captured as well, spotted cucumber beetle. So with this guy, it's interesting because we also see that, there are some captures at the beginning. And then again, once the field is planted, the captures seem to really drop with the pheromone only. But where the floral lure is, it's also on the field, we see that there is an increase on those captures. And this just really kind of agrees with those observations that they feed mostly on the flowers and the foliage, right? So they're really attracted to that scent. It's just an interesting trend here. And we see, very high numbers. There's large variation here on this very last point because, some of the traps didn't have as many beetles, but, some of the traps had up to 200 beetles on farm number 1. Then we have farm number 2. And again, with the Western striped cucumber beetle. So the average number of beetles captured per trap here, and we had to do a broken axis graph because there were such high numbers, they were going up to the 300s per trap. And then we wanted to make sure that the other data with the pheromone was actually visible as well. But it is quite interesting to see that all of these trends are very dependent on what is going on in your field. So for example, on this field, farm number 1 had a period where there were no crops in there. Whereas farm number 2, actually they planted their cucurbits in late April. So we had cucurbits already by late April in there. So we see that the pheromone is not as efficient, of course, because there's fruit and there's flower in the field. And so it's kind of hard to outcompete that. However, once again, when we introduce the floral lure, we see that there are some peaks there, and there is not that many, we have 20 per average. But once the harvest occurs and, the crop residue senesces, we see a very large increase in the number of captures. And again, this is not too informative for monitoring if it's at the end of the season. However, this year we're starting much earlier in the sampling, and we want to see whether we have the same effect at the beginning of the year. So I actually already have traps out there in a farm, and I'm trying to see that, if you start collecting, if you start treating these guys at the very beginning of the season when there is no melons out there, can you have the same effect of capturing so many beetles, right? And then we have the Western spotted cucumber beetle. And man, these numbers were insane. We had thousands of beetles to count at the very end. And again, the Western spotted seem to be very, very attracted to the floral lure and the pheromone treatment. And where, we still had a substantial amount on captures for the pheromone, where we had, 100, I think it's 180 per trap. But then we have upwards to 900, and that was just amazing to see at the very end And I'm hoping to see if there will be a similar effect at the beginning this season. So stay tuned. Hopefully, same time next year, you'll probably be hearing from me again, and we'll see whether we had something similar occurring or not. And here is just a visualization, just pictures for you guys to have a better understanding of what it looked like in the field. So these traps are just the pheromone plus ferolure. You can see that, there is, I would say, about 800 beetles in there, and they're both western spotted and striped cucumber beetle. We have the pheromone alone, where we also have a good amount of beetles captured in there. You probably think there's 20 of them in there, but there's actually 75 or so. And then, the control, but I still had some captures in there, but that's just, some random effects because of the wind and whatnot. And so in conclusion, right, what does this all mean? And how does this, again, relate to IPM for cucumber beetles? So I think it's pretty clear that vitatolactone, which is the name of the pheromone, holds a promise for an IPM tool for cucumber beetles. The pheromone is still at the research phase. It is not commercially available, but running this type of studies really increases the opportunity to put this information out there and hopefully have it available in the near future. And we're also interested in noting that there is a synergetic effect in combining the floral lure plus the pheromone, which is quite interesting. But it also it depends, right, whether you have it at the beginning of the season or after the season. But during the time that your crop is in the field, it's kind of hard to really tell whether there is a control effect or not for managing these beetles. And moreover, this pheromone can increase, could be developed as a attract and kill management tool. So, it could really increase those numbers of capturing thousands of beetles, if it's designed in an attract and kill way. The way that we are doing the study is just mostly for monitoring, because we're only using clear sticky cards, but this could be an opportunity for something else, such as an attract and kill strategy. And so in summary, I hope that I communicated this well, but pretty much I just wanted to drive the message, that the western striped cucumber beetle and the spotter are both pests of cucurbits out here in California. The more detrimental species is the striped cucumber beetle, right? They really love that fruit, and they love to feed on that zucchini, squash, everything, because they have the cucurbitacins on the surface of the fruit, and it's a feeding stimulant, right? So they just tend to feed very, very much on that fruit and in the surface of that fruit. And then we also know that elucidating and identifying the noncrop hosts for western striped cucumber beetle can improve the time efficiency and effort when you're monitoring for this pest out there, right? So you are going to be spending less time looking for these beetles everywhere, where hopefully you can just go to a patch of weeds and be like, okay, they're here, and maybe treat those weeds, or have some other options. And last but not least, vitatolactone is a promising management strategy, and we're hoping that it can be developed further into attract and kill if we see those significant effects again of very large captures at the beginning of the season. So with that in mind, I would just like to acknowledge all the people and everyone that has been involved in this research. Our funding agency, the California Melon Research Board, cooperating growers who have allowed me to be out there putting traps in their premises, and have been very helpful at directing me to where they have seen beetles before. The UCNR advisors, specifically Amber Vincenzi-Val, who is also one of my advisors for my thesis project, and it's been quite helpful in having this evaluating my experimental designs. Margaret Lloyd, who has been super helpful at giving us contact with growers and also coming out with us to the fields. And last but not least, the Grettenberger lab and all those undergrads that also helped me count those thousands of beetles. And Yeah, with that, I will take questions. Thank you very much.